Michael, let's talk about geopolitical risks to the energy sector, specifically what is happening with respect to Russia, Ukraine. Do you see energy supplies being affected?
Look, Larissa, what we're seeing in the global oil market right now is geopolitical risk at the moment. We'll see if this turns into geopolitical reality in terms of actual barrels coming offline as a function of Russia, Ukraine. I think what's really important is that when you think about the geopolitical side of the equation, it also cuts both ways. And what I mean by that is if Russia, Ukraine is a potentially bullish geopolitical catalyst, there's also bearish geopolitical catalyst as well for pricing in terms of Iran. So what I think is important for how we think about the framework right now, Larissa, is geopolitics really helps to ignite the bull view. But let me be clear here. I think the oil market fundamental backdrop is perhaps the most bullish that I've seen in my career. I also think that when we think about the geopolitical backdrop in this market, I think it's really important to highlight that I think a lot of market participants conflate the idea of a geopolitical price risk premium from a resource scarcity premium. And what I think is really important in terms of dividing those two things up into distinct categories is if you think about a geopolitical risk premium, that's what we're seeing being priced in the market today as a function of Russia, Ukraine. This could last another day, this could last another week, this could last another month, and so on. What I think is really important, though, is this is the market pricing for potential supply disruption risk. When you think about the second idea that I just mentioned, resource scarcity premium, this is a function of inventories being very low at some point in time. And as a function of this, we have the market paying more for resource security. You start building up a rainy day fund. You start paying a lot to bid these barrels up to keep them so that you have them in the future, just in case there is further disruption. So I think that resource scarcity is something that can last for a much more protracted period of time. That's one of the reasons why we're so bullish on the oil market right now.
Russia is such a key oil and gas supplier, especially to Europe. Do you think ultimately Europe can wean itself off of Russia?
Yeah, you know what? It's a difficult question. I mean, when you look at the amount of exports into Russia, it's about 40% that goes to Europe. I mean, natural gas, Europe is very dependent on Russia. It's very difficult to figure out a situation where Europe can really wean itself off without massively rewriting the global landscape of the global energy trade. And what I mean by that is if you look at Europe and Europe looks to other countries to try to figure out where they can potentially buy barrels from, you're looking at places like the US for more LNG, you're looking for more oil. And I think the idea here is this is going to be highly inflationary for the European consumer, right? Because right now you have Russia in your own backyard. You can pull those barrels, you can pull those molecules from there very easily. If you look to other suppliers, it takes longer to ultimately travel to where you need to go. And there's always disruption risk. And oil and gas prices are being bid up across the world. So this is going to be highly inflationary for Europe. There's no easy solution at this point.
Can Canada step in, I guess, as a supplier? And does this change the narrative for Canadian producers who were focused on, I guess, investing in climate change?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, the ability for Canada to immediately step in and provide a shock of supply back into some of these countries that may be short, like Europe, et cetera, is going to be exceedingly difficult because we just don't have large scale export capacity pointed in the right directions at this point. Now, what I think is really important is when we think about the energy, transition, like you mentioned, I think that events like this really, really lift the hood in terms of how we think about energy dependency. Now, the idea of energy independence that the US uses, that we may use as Canadians, North America, it's very difficult to think about unpacking this during times like this in the sense that, you're trying to transition, the whole world is, but when you look at other countries like Germany that have weaned their way off their nukes, you look at Europe that has been arguably at the forefront of the energy transition, this really, I think, lifts the hood and shows the cracks of how fast you can actually really try to transition and what's actually really plausible at this point. So I think the idea of transition sounds great when you're in a period of overabundance of energy resources, like what we've seen over the course of much of the past 10 years. But when there's frictions and when there's tight supplies and when there's a war, it really lifts the hood on just how fragile some of this energy transition, or at least the pace of the energy transition, really is.
With respect to oil prices, do you think they can stay at the levels that they're at? And what are some of the ingredients that come into play when you think about OPEC or the US shale patch?
Yeah, Larissa, look, I think that oil prices can go meaningfully higher, where we've put together a framework where we think that we're in the early days of a super cycle. So what do I mean when I talk about oil prices going higher? We think that we could see $115 a barrel by the middle of summer. What I think is really important is that if we've spent the past 10 years in an energy overabundance situation where we've just had too much supply, I think what's really important here is we've spent the past 12 to 18 months really de-risking a lot of the supply side shocks in the market. So when I think about that, we are running down global inventories. And when I say running down global inventories back to normal, I don't mean pre-COVID normal. I don't mean the 5-year average normal. I mean, we've run inventories all the way back down to the pre-Arab Spring level, where we were in $100, $120 oil price framework. So we've really de-risked a lot of the key ideas on the supply side. Now, what I think is really important here is if we're searching for the next frontier of what drives oil prices, we think it's ultimately demand destruction. And to be honest, Larissa, I'm not sure that I can think of a more constructive framework than talking about oil prices needing to go to the point of demand destruction. Now, let's break this down. If we think we go to demand destruction, where does that leave prices? Well, you go back to, well, when's the last time we actually saw demand destruction? We went back and looked at the Arab Spring time, 2011 to 2013, 14. We had gasoline prices in the US that were similar to where they are now, so $3.60 a gallon. We didn't see demand destruction back then. So we went back even further and looked at 2008. 2008 in June, what we saw was north of $4 a gallon gasoline. That's when we started to see demand destruction. Now, what I think is really important here is if you inflation adjust for $4 a gallon gasoline in 2008, that takes us to about $5.20 now. Now, certainly that is a price that would hit the pocketbook of American consumers, and we could potentially see demand destruction. The idea here is I think demand is actually going to be stickier than what we all realize. And the reason why is because, number one, we've been stuck at home for much of the past 2 years. And number two, we, as a function of COVID, we all have so much more in terms of discretionary savings rates. And as a function of those two things, I think we're all ready to get back out and travel again, get back out and live again. So if it costs an extra 20 cents or 30 cents to a gallon to drive your car to go on that weekend trip, I think you're going to do it. So the way I think about the market is we think that we still see a lot of demand that we can push forward into the summer. And as a function of that, this is what drives our very bullish view in terms of how we think about the market.
Give us an idea of some of the risks to this this bullish view. I mean, your most recent notes for RBC are very optimistic, but without a doubt, you've factored in some of the risks.
It's a great question, Larissa, because everything, the fundamental framework, like I said, is the most bullish in a very long time. So if we think about the biggest risks in terms of why could oil prices fall quite meaningfully over a short period of time, I think a lot of it has to do with the interconnectedness of the global markets across different asset classes. And what I mean by that is if you think about key relationships in the global macro framework, what you see is the dollar index, the dollar is very strong, oil prices are very strong. Historically, these two things have not been able to coexist at a level that we've seen now. For example, the dollar index right now is about 96. When you look at WTI prices, they're about $95, $96 a barrel. Again, historically speaking, we have never seen these two asset classes price this high at the same time. So I think that's a framework that if you're a global macro trader and you are bent on being long the dollar, how do you think about WTI? Well, that's a relationship that has to break down, right? So that to me is my fear in this market, where given the Fed, given inflation, given the conflation of all these different asset classes, I think that if you get a global macro framework that seizes, you could potentially see downside to WTI or to global oil markets. But on a standalone basis, I think the fundamentals of the oil market arguably haven't been this strong in 15 or 20 years.